Hey, what's up, everybody? I know lots of people are going to be moving around from thing to thing. We're gonna get started. Some people might move in and out. But hey, we're here giving a little panel on teaching code as a liberal art. Hello, I'm Todd Anderson. I'm an assistant professor of code as a liberal art here at Eugene Lang College of the New School. And I'm joined by Shin and Grayson Earle. They'll tell you a little more about what they're teaching and working on a little bit later. But we're just going to kind of give a short little presentation on some of the different ways that we've integrated teaching code in a more liberal arts context. And kind of what I mean by that is teaching code in the broad context of things that a modern citizen of the world should know, rather than a specific technical job, skill, and in and of itself. A lot of that, for me, comes into like tying code into different real topics and issues that exist in the world, and that tying code in with the other range of studies that exist through the liberal arts. So I'm going to talk about. Let me make sure I have my timer here. I'm going to talk about a few kind of just general lessons I've learned now that I've been teaching here for a few years, and some different things I've discovered in teaching code as a liberal art. I'm just going to be pulling up a bunch of different URLs here. So one thing that I think I like to start with is that for teaching code as a liberal art, one of the things you want to do, and it's kind of surprising how few maybe computer science classes clear this bar, is to teach a topic and teach a subject that is worth studying even if you don't know code. That there's something there that's worth thinking about. It's important enough to our society that it's worth digging into whether or not you know code, and then learning about the code around it helps you study it a little more deeply and get a unique perspective. So this is some material we use from, this is on textfiles.com from a class that I teach called Viruses, Botnets, and Ransomware, a history of computers doing bad things. And kind of what is, this class is always really exciting and fun for students in hearing some of this history of viruses, but there's just like so much interesting like ethnography and history of these different files of how people were teaching each other how to code viruses. Who were these people? What sort of systems were they breaking into? Here's a humble polymorphic engine primer from our good friend Absolute Overlord, who is going to teach you how to write a decryption loop. I think my favorite is, Dark Angel. Dark Angel is a pretty good technical writer. You could see him working for O'Reilly in this modern day and age, but just also hates people who don't know how to use computers and wants to punish them. There's lots of like different characters in here. There's a lot of stories worth telling that we kind of dig into in that class. I can give you a peek at the syllabus. Then we'll also hop into a Windows 7 virtual machine and kind of open up the console, and I'll show students how different ways people, once they have access to your computer, how they might crash it, and or what kind of background processes they run. This isn't like necessarily useful practical application coding, but it does give them a kind of deeper understanding of how the coding works on an underlying level, because it's connected to this broader history, and they can see like, oh, I read this text by a person who was coding at this time in this concept, and now I can demo out some of the things that they were doing, or some of the same concepts they were accessing. So along that idea, another subject that I teach is, I teach different types of creative writing using code and using digital tools. And so I look at Twitter bots a lot. And so here's a magical realism bot. We've got a sentient testicle visits Newcastle on the night of the full moon. It places a tiny desert into every little girl's ear. I maybe regret reading that into a documented talk. A doctoral student is writing a list of people who will be saved: a veterinarian, a huntsman, and a poet. Nice. In Toronto, there is a pastry chef who has a diamond eye. So like, a lot of these are like cool, interesting texts that we could read and say something about. One can imagine if this was just like found in a dusty old library book in the late 19th century. So we might have some this text is really interesting. I'm going to show the Ephemerides, another kind of poetry by Alison Parrish. This one, he cannot pass, and at he lags. They therefore tide the dogs, descend and the rate, however. So these things, I think, are worthy cultural objects on their own, but then by learning some of the generative algorithms that go into making these texts, we can, in a more sophisticated way, learn to critique them, talk about them, and think about making this kind of work. And so that'll kind of transition me to my next point that I've really learned in a helpful way of teaching code as a liberal art, in that one of the common issues that comes up is you'll have students from a variety of backgrounds. You'll have some students who maybe have taken some coding before and really want to run with that, but then you'll have a lot of students who it's their first time and you want to get them kind of up and running in the subject material. You don't have time to do a full intro to CS course of how to do, here's how you do variables and loops and conditionals and object-oriented programming and all of that stuff. And so I think I rely on a lot is starting a lot with templates and examples and allowing students to start by modifying those and then leaving more and more blanks over time. So in the vein of code examples, or in the vein of Twitter bots, I'll have a Twitter bot that looks like this. This is from a bot I made when Peter Thiel bankrupted Gawker through a funded lawsuit. It's just stories of different billionaires bankrupting different publications for different petty reasons. But then I have this code example. This is on glitch.com, which is a website I really love using. So let me put my code example here, and then the student can just remix the project. And then what if instead we have maybe a list of billionaires here, and we can, instead of these people, we can put Todd and Shin and Grayson here, and then look, oh, okay, wow, Grayson, you're really busy. And then we can kind of mess around with the code examples, and students can play with a computational tool and using their own writing and kind of get excited about the process and envision the ends. I find that's a really important way to gain momentum in a class, is to have students kind of have a vision of where they want to go, and then they can over time learn to build more and more of the way there themselves. I'm not going to dig too deeply into it, but I'll also briefly shout out IPython Notebook as another like this. So I teach a lot of web stuff, and Glitch is great for web things, but then for something like Python, Google Colab I found to be a pretty good tool, as you can have these notebooks and then students can run them and edit them and kind of have this interactive coding experience where they're first editing their own examples before they have to write their own code. And the final thing that's, I think, showed up in a number of my classes, and this ties in really well with what Ari was kind of just talking about, is that I find it's really important if you're teaching technology in a liberal arts context to not just teach the technology in a kind of distant, neutral way, but to be actively thinking about the implications of the technology you're learning and thinking about how it's deployed in real life and what are the potential issues that can come up when it's deployed poorly, or that times in the past when people haven't thought through these instances before they release them. So like, for example, so this is like a Python notebook we're actually using in my Code as a Liberal Art class this week, where we're learning to build just like very basic kind of like interactive air quotes chatbots. It's really just like having a conversation with a computer. But alongside that, we're reading some stuff by this guy. This is Joseph Weizenbaum, the creator of the Eliza chatbot, back in the 80s, maybe even earlier. But who wrote, it was a computer program that pretended to be a psychologist. And at the time, there was a lot of kind of like, Joseph Weizenbaum didn't expect this, but like a lot of positive reception from the psychology community of like, wow, this computer is great. We can use this to like see way more patients than we could normally. And they can just type their responses into the computer program, and we can provide psychiatric help in that way. And then so he wrote a really cool text that I highly recommend to you. called Computer Power and Human Reason, and which is a lot about kind of like the motivation behind it is some of the like reasons why you can't just like assume that a computer understands a human situation, or that reducing a human situation, in particularly in a mental health context, to just what a computer can understand cuts a lot out of the image and some of the dangers of that. So we're trying to educate people to like, and we talk about this even as my students are making very basic programs, like what are you leaving out when you're trying to reduce or like portray a real life situation in a computational context. And then I'm going a little over, but the last thing I'll show, yeah, we've got bots should punch up. This is just ways of making Twitter bots that don't harass people or hurt people. Another branch of ethics in that area that we do, and I'll just call back. I already mentioned this briefly, but we're going to be doing machine learning a little later in my class. Weapons of math destruction is a good primer on like when you're doing machine learning or big data sort of projects, some of the ways those can do big oversights or re-implement bias that exists in your data. So yeah, that's all I'll talk about, and I'm happy to turn things over to Shin, who will be talking to you about one of their classes. Yeah.
So my name is Xin. I go by Dayden. I'm currently assistant professor at the new school Parsons in design and technology. But today I'm gonna talk to you about a class that I taught at a different school. Early last year, in spring 2019, I was teaching at the University of Georgia in Athens, in the South. I taught a class called Design Fiction, Speculative Reproductive System. It was a class that was cross-listed between women's studies as well as the art program. And that was a really incredible sort of transformative experience for me, because being in that position of being a joint professor between gender studies and media design, I had to really think about the overlap and how those two things intersect. If you go to a gender study conference, you would hear one set of language, one sort of ecosystem of thinking and sensing, and there's very particular frame of references within the discipline of gender studies. And the same goes to computation and media design, and a lot of times the references are even more obscure and more narrow. So how do I bring these two things together, and what kind of readings and what kind of references exist? So I would say after like researching and figuring out how to teach this class, I came away with a lot, in the sense of, yes, there are a lot of intersections. There are a lot of people, amazing scholars, amazing artists, amazing thinkers working at the intersection between gender studies and media design and computation. But at the same time, as an educator, I don't always have to sort of be this kind of, like, present this like representation of like the perfect established discipline of the interdisciplinary. So it became a really interesting question for me. At first, in the beginning of the class, I was trying to teach the class, by the way, it was a bimodal class. It was part seminar and part studio, and at first I was really trying to teach it in the way where seminar would transition into studio back to seminar as seamlessly as possible. After a while, I realized that that attempt and that need to create that seamless transition also reflect part of my insecurity as an educator, because it turns out that my students are totally, have the agency and have the intelligence to connect multiple different kinds of points and perspective together on their own. So I think that I realized that there are two approaches to having this kind of bimodal classroom. One is connecting, finding very strong connection between the overlap of computation and gender studies. But then another way is simply present two worlds to them and see what happens. So the way I like describing the experience of being in that class to people is that essentially every single class, it's kind of like we held the books of Audre Lorde, Donna Haraway, Jose Esteban Munoz, Laboria Kubanics, Bobby Preciado, and Legacy Russell on our left hand, and we use our right hand to hold the mice and click and drag in a 3D software and programming. And so that was essentially what the class became as a standard format. This would be like example of a class, right? Like we would spend the first 1.5 hour really breaking down an essay by Audre Lorde, in this case using some of the erotics, and spend the second half of the class, diving into 3D software, learning about how computer graphics work and what goes behind the black box. And so that was really interesting in the sense of produce a lot of things that I didn't really expect. And what I didn't expect was that the conversation that we had in the first part of class and the keywords and languages that was being pulled out of the seminar session, like over time, transition into the second part of class. Students start referring and reflecting and thinking about software, and in this case, we're using Blender, which is open source 3D modeling software, in these critical ways that I didn't really anticipate it. And so it really became a very collaborative experience. So some of the stuff that we talked about in this class, and just to give you a very, very quick primer, I only have 7 minutes. We talk about, there's such a huge, incredibly complex topic, reproductive system, and what has been done with it and what to do with it. So part as an intersectional feminist class, part of the class is talking about the problematic term of referring to this organ as reproductive system. The word reproductive is an essentializing term, talking about aligning the form of an organ and the function of an organ to what it's meant to do. So we started the class by looking at a kind of historical lineages of how reproductive system has been made and remade through fantasies and speculations. Historically, it has always been very sexist, mostly, and also oftentimes very racist. And this is one of the earliest example from ancient. It's originated in a Medic text in ancient Greece. The idea of the wandering uterus, that a uterus is actually almost has its own mind, has its own agency, and would wander around your body as and not something that's static. And there are multiple different kind of ideas for treatment of how to hold the uterus in place. And there's before the Victorian era in the West, there was something called the one-sex model that was proposed by Galen, who's an automatist, who believed that it's almost very abstract to describe this now because we're living such a different time. But before the Victorian era, and when Galen proposed the one-sex model, it was believed that female reproductive system was the inverted version of a male reproductive system. So you can think about almost origami that can be pulled inside out. That is the relationship between female and male organ. So these kind of ideas and sort of understanding of and narratives constructed around what female and male reproductive system is has always been, very much based around meditation on form and thinking around forms. So I'm gonna skip. Oh yeah, so this is one of the quotes by Galen. Turn outward, the woman's turn inward, so to speak, and both double the men. And you will find the same in both in every respect. And jump forward to like post-Victorian, like thinking about how reproductive system, our first kind of encounter of it in like our sex ed class has turned into this kind of dissection, this kind of like diagrams, and almost sort of like portrayed as like a utilitarian space that has its own kind of production flow. It's almost like a factory, and I think that there are all these sort of like hidden narratives and hidden sort of like push and pulls of how reproductive systems, how treatment or how like the medical field like deals with it that still contains a lot of biases. So that was a lot of what we're talking about. This is like some of the current like technology on like artificial reproductive technology on how the process of reproduction can be taken outside of the body. So part of what the class was really interested in is instead of following this lineage of patriarchal thinking and conceptualization of reproductive system, how can we sort of go out of that and think about feminist work making in the context of computation, in the context of new media. And we use 3D software as our main tool. And at times in class, we talk about 3D software almost doubling as a reproductive space. At worst, it mirrors it reinforces the toxic biases of what an ideal body looks like. If we think about like all the kind of like idealized 3D bodies that are sort of like the templates that we see when we download a human body online, and also because I was working with gender studies students, they are intuitively very, very good at critiquing tools and critiquing design and critiquing system and reflecting on how some of the design of 3D software sort of reinforce the idea of an ableist symmetrical body that tend to be athletic, move across the space seamlessly. At the same time, we also found a lot of possibilities, right? Because software are very, very fragile. It has no interest in retaining human forms or our sort of like ideas of what a perfect human should look like. And so there was a lot of opportunities to think about how do we transgress that? How do we transgress the boundary of the body, of the form, through the lens of queer futurity, through the lens of this kind of like intersectional and anti-sexist work. So, okay, I'll just like go through a few projects quickly. So this is one of the class project we made. It's called Speculative Reproductive Cross-Cell Organ. So this is an example. What our method a lot of times was like creating this design chart that has on one hand present-day reality, on the other hand speculative scenarios. So it's almost like this sort of class that was a practice on speculative design, but also on science fiction, like prop making or body making. And 3D software became a space for us to really sketch through some of our imagination and make it materialize, even just virtually. Thank you.
Hey, my name's Grayson. I'm currently teaching as an adjunct at Parsons in the Design and Technology department, and last semester was at Eugene Lang as part of this Code as a Liberal Arts initiative. I taught a class there that I had developed previously at Oberlin College, first as crypto-cultural productions and then renamed here as Money as Medium. So a question that I get a lot is why choose cryptocurrency as a subject for a liberal arts class or a code class? I think one way of answering this is, well, first of all, one of the benefits of teaching code as a liberal art is that if you have a research-based arts practice, you can take a project that you've done and look at all of the research that you've mapped out and then turn it into a course. And so for me, I was happy that this got mentioned in the last talk. My project Bail Block, which was a cryptocurrency mining distributed software where all of the funds were directed to bail people out of jail in New York City. And so through the work that I did on this project, it put me in touch with people from all sorts of organizations and got me into all sorts of interesting spaces. I was able to kind of put together a course that I thought would do some interesting things. So to return to the question of why cryptocurrency as a subject, one way of looking at this is if cryptocurrency or blockchain technology becomes the increasingly important or the dominant financial system, then it's going to be really important for us to have literacy in this subject, right? To be able to understand what is happening under the hood. And also liberal arts students, tend to go on to jobs as journalists or work in NGOs or politics, things like that. And so the goal of teaching a class like this is to produce, critical thinkers who can interpret this emerging technology that otherwise only benefits a small group of people in the financial class and in Silicon Valley. I've now been to 10 cryptocurrency conferences around the world, and one thing that is always the same is the demographic makeup. It's basically a sea of white dudes, and so you have to wonder how revolutionary is this financial system if it's benefiting the exact same cast of characters. And so that was my kind of jumping off point in thinking about cryptocurrency from a radical leftist perspective. So it's not only about thinking about the increasing ubiquity and technology in the financial systems, my class, but also in adjacent subjects like algorithmic bail, which got mentioned in the previous talk, bias and machine learning, which also was mentioned, and software-based governance models in general. One of the things that I love to stoke as a debate in my class is if you were to write an algorithm that ran for president rather than elect a president, what platform would that be and how would that get written? And then people come to the table with their candidates, and then we sort of have a debate about how that might work or might not work, point out some of the problems, that kind of thing. So essentially teaching code as a liberal art is a way of addressing the question of who benefits from an increasingly technological world and how do we produce thinkers who can counter the dominance of existing power structures. One really great thing about teaching code as a liberal art also is just creating lines of sight across all of the different disciplines that students are already engaged in, right? So for example, something like gender studies being adjacent to economics in the sense that we talked about Silvia Federici and her Wages for Housework and Wages Against Housework, and which was basically grew out of the Italian internationalist womenist movement in the 1970s, and was basically a way of kind of demanding wages for housework, partially just to render that work as visible to begin with, right? Because at that point, people hadn't even, many people, dominant society hadn't considered the work that was being done at home, predominantly by women, to be labor or payable, wageable labor at all, right? So she was sort of changing the conception of that. And then, of course, we expand this in the class to talk about Angela Davis, who kind of took this in another direction by saying, well, we shouldn't be demanding wages for housework at all. We should be creating a society that applies industrialization and automation to the task of housework to alleviate that labor, in the same way that we have machines creating cars for us. If reproductive labor, if reproduction is essential to society, which it is, then why isn't society, essential to it? Why isn't it aiding in that production? And so this leads us, back into crypto again. If we're talking about automation and industrialization, how might a software system that is governing a financial system intersect with some of these problems? How might it sort of preclude them to begin with, right? If written into the code of the Bitcoin network or whatever was, an if statement that said if the gender gap exists, then no more transactions occur on the network, well, that would make our society look a lot different, right? So another way of thinking about that is feminism or critical theory or anti-racism could be inscribed into the rules as code of the financial system, right? And another sort of adjacent project that we talked about that's super relevant is Laurel Tax Wages for Facebook, which was taking Silvia Federici's project and applying it to the idea of social networks. So we are all engaged in labor that has, I think, in part because of people like Laurel, become rendered, but at least to begin with, and I think still in large part, is not really considered labor, right? We don't demand a wage for what we're doing for these platforms, even though we are creating the content that makes them valuable. And so Laurel Tax Wages for Facebook, which I highly recommend you look up on Google when you get home or during the break, demands wages for it, but in a way that's not necessarily meant to succeed in that demand per se, but rather that by allowing us to reconceptualize engaging in Facebook as labor, it changes our relation to it. It makes us not want to do it. And I have to say, after I encountered this project, I basically dropped off of Facebook. Another project that we talked about in my class that's a bit more crypto-centric is Terra Zero, and I have to mention this because I think it's just such a fantastic project. Basically, the idea is that, and I had Max Hampshire, who worked on the project, visit my class, which was really amazing. The idea is that you gift an algorithm to a forest, and that algorithm runs on the Ethereum network. And I'm sorry, it would take a long time to get people up to speed on exactly how a cryptocurrency works in a way that might make this make sense. But the algorithm is given a plot of land, a forest, and it basically sells itself off at a predictable rate to mining companies, or to logging companies, I'm sorry. And over time, it accrues enough profit to buy its own autonomy in perpetuity. And then you can kind of imagine this as an autonomous software agent that replicates itself until you have, what's that saying? Make America a endless forest of trees again. What is this? Like a borderless landscape of natural forests again. Anyway, the idea is that this could replicate itself until you have this massive forests. The last thing I'll say in the class that I thought was kind of exciting was I developed for this most recent iteration ClassCoin. So it was a cryptocurrency for our class, and then as an assignment, the students had to create a wallet and create a node on their laptop, which meant they had to run software that would upkeep the network by validating transactions. And then they had to mine the currency, which is sort of part of this node process. They had to enter into this lottery system that happens and yada yada, I won't get into it, but they had to accrue ClassCoin, which you could think of as like an offshoot of Bitcoin, in order to pass the assignment. But then I also said that the person who got the most would get extra credit. And so one of these questions that I kept getting throughout the semester was, why do people think that Bitcoin has value? Why does that, or what, and the answer is always kind of the same. It's like, well, people will pay for it. Why does the US dollar have value? And so it's still this kind of thing that it's hard to grapple with, like, why does this digital thing have any value? And so one thing that was kind of funny about this, and I should ask, actually, is anyone from HR here? Okay, good. So this sort of informal economy emerged in my class where once I was satisfied that people had set up their miners, their nodes, and their wallets, they had completed the assignment, people wanted to get the extra credit, and so I picked up on the fact that some people who are really good at the mining were selling ClassCoin to the other students, and so ClassCoin achieved, having a US dollar exchange value, which I thought was pretty exciting. So anyway, I'll stop there. Here's my details if you want to look into it. And then we're going to do like a Q&A, yeah? Okay, cool.
Hey, what's up? So I also wanted to mention, we did originally have one other panelist, Earle, who's also a computer science educator here at the new school, but she is sick today and could not make it. So we've got time we've got like 3 to 4 minutes for questions if anyone has questions from the audience.
You had mentioned one strategy for working with students who have like really different backgrounds and skills. Does anyone want to elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that would be challenging.
Yeah, so the question was working with students of different levels and backgrounds. I talked about
In the context of coding specifically, I think my approach on that has been providing multiple resources and ways of learning, and that is difficult in some ways because it adds a lot of extra layers of work on the instructor. But I have tried, for instance, if it's a technical tutorial, I would provide a video, a written tutorial, and in-class tutorial, and other, any modes of learning that I might gather from that would be effective for my students. Sometimes I would point them to resources that might be in another language. It just depends on what their backgrounds are. But I also find, in the context of the class I just mentioned, I was working with mostly gender studies students who have never taken an art class or use 3D software in any ways. And I was also teaching art students who are working with like traditional craft mostly and doesn't have any background in like new media. So I think finding reference points, finding things that are familiar to them, and explain things, in their reference, in their frame of reference, as much as I could possibly do, is something that I find very useful. So, for instance, I had a student, fine art student, who was a ceramics major, and even though she was really good and really experienced with like form building with like clay, like it's a transition from that into like working with 3D models, but finding ways like speaking her frames and speaking her familiar zone, I think was part of the challenge, but also the joy of being a teacher. It's a lot of emotional labor, a lot of research, and a lot of preparation.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah, and I have one small thing to add on the different backgrounds question, because it's usually framed with different backgrounds in coding or like beginner coders, and then some people have more experience. How do you get the beginner coders up to speed? How do you keep the people with experience interested and engaged? And I found I'm like pretty good at managing through some of the strategies Shin was describing of like providing materials for the beginner coders. The thing I'm personally working on to try and get better is how to, like, for example, I teach this class digital creative writing. It's a mix of writing and coding, and how do I spend more time on teaching people how to write in a class like that, because coding is scarier for a lot of people, and so it's natural to spend more time on that. But you might have someone who comes in who's experienced with coding, and could use some help in like learning how to structure a written thing or how to write better paragraphs and that kind of stuff, but might not be as inclined to say like, hey, I really need help with this. Can I help? And so I think that's also like trying to present there being like everyone has areas to learn in the class and be useful for me. So I'm sorry, we are out of time. Would love to talk with you more about this subject, but I think we have another talk that's trying to get in here. So thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks to you all.